I'll have them jump on and say hi, but I'm Ann Kingsley. I'm the distance education coordinator. I'm joined with Crystala. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Crystala Button. I'm the training and technology coordinator.
And we are also here with Kat.
Hey all, nice to see so many of you. I'm an instructional technologist here at DVC.
Awesome. And let me share my screen. Okay. And can people see my screen okay? Okay.
Yes.
So a quick overview. This is a very superficial overview, but I wanted to kind of show it in all of its messiness because hybrid is a little bit messy because there's lots of different forms of hybrid. Like when we're talking about on campus, physical face-to-face, that is one very specific way of teaching and thinking. And then when we think about, okay, fully online, COVID burst that bubble open with, okay, synchronous, asynchronous, all types of variations of what online learning look like. And then we have at DVC the partially online world, which is a term that's kind of floated around. We use that in our scheduling. That's how our students register and understand the difference between face-to-face, partially online, and fully online are the terms that we give in course schedules. But then, as many of you are very familiar with, we have to then add a whole bunch of scheduling notes to clarify what that even means. So partially online at DVC means any course taught from 1 to 50% of its percentage taught online, or from 50 to 99%. And I'll explain what that means in a second, why there's two forms of partially online. Sometimes that 1 to 50% of the class, if it's online, is also called web enhanced. And then sort of our traditional hybrid would be that 50 to 99%. Pre-COVID, because the COVID offerings are obviously a little bit more difficult to kind of understand what we offered during COVID. But pre-COVID, we offered approximately 209 sections of partially online / hybrid courses. Again, that's anything with that previous definition between 1 and 99% online. And then in fall 2020, we offered about 220. And from what I could see when I was looking at the data, that we have like very kind of slowly and measured every year increase that hybrid sections by around like 10 course sections. So it's not this like huge increase that we're looking at, but it was a gradual increase of hybrid offerings. Part of this was a drive towards space planning and the use of space on campus, which was becoming problematic. And that is likely to continue as we go forward as well. The fear of hybrid was always like how to maintain those two portions of the class and those two modalities, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in general, people were kind of moving towards hybrid as a way to free up room space on campus and as an alternative to fully online, so that it might help some people's schedules to just have to be on campus for that particular class once a week, and that the online would provide some flexibility, but then you would still have the connection back to campus. There were very different kinds of hybrid courses we offered. And again, I'm talking about pre-COVID. For example, a traditional one might be 50% of your course meets on campus, and then 50% would be online in an asynchronous setting, online modality. And then another example, and this was in our art department, our studio art classes, 90% of the course was on campus and like 10% was in an online asynchronous setting. Another example is our math classes prior to COVID were all partially online because exams were held in person or on campus. So practically anywhere between 80 to 90% of the course was online asynchronous, but there was this other portion of the course that was partially online because there were exams that were on campus or in person. So forward thinking, you can see that there's just this huge ground of what constitutes hybrid. And this isn't meant to like confuse everyone. It's just meant to give a snapshot that we didn't have sort of like this clean, this is what partially online is on our campus. It was being used in various ways. And because it was just a small part of our course offerings, the scheduling notes weren't so confusing for the student because not every class was replicating those kinds of notes. Going forward, it's likely that we're going to have a very diverse and nuanced and variable schedule that includes all kinds of classes. And so something to just keep in mind is whether it's in your department or just yourself as an instructor, if you're able to choose these classes, is thinking about like, what's the best place for hybrid to start, and what's the most kind of clear way into this form of teaching that doesn't make it so complicated and kind of confusing for students. Just a really quick, I pulled these off of like Tableau, which is our data management section, which is that in 2019, you can see on the far left box, the large box, in 2019, 1,778 sections were offered face-to-face or on campus. That 75% is the fill rate. So just as a kind of heads up, you can see how much was offered online, 239 fully online sections. That's at 100% online. We are now starting to break that into async and sync, just as an FYI, but in spring 2019, that really wasn't on our radar. Most of our fully online classes were asynchronous, maybe an orientation, maybe one or two required events, but nothing like we're seeing right now. And then with hybrid, you can see those two hybrids, the 50% or less, 131 offerings, and the hybrid 50 to 99% was 78 offerings. And again, you can see those fill rates. If that is significant to you, you can see that our online courses filled a lot. Our hybrid 50% or less filled around 62, and hybrid in this kind of half and half modality was only like 45%, which is interesting. There's not like a ton of conclusions you can rapidly make because it could be class, it could be circumstances, it could be coding inside the registration and confusion of scheduling notes. So it's not that students are just not choosing that hybrid 50 to 99%, but all we can say is that they filled less. Same thing with fall 2019. You can see the same interface here with face-to-face, fully online, hybrid 50% or less, and hybrid 50 to 99%, and a kind of snapshot of our total course offerings. Obviously, COVID will change, has changed this up very rapidly, and we're not sure exactly where we're going to fall, but this was kind of the preview of what we saw as our hybrid offerings before. And when you add the two together, the two forms of hybrid, it's nearer about what we offer in fully online. Course success rates, you can see these here. Again, hybrid is not an easy one to keep track of. That hybrid one, which is that 0 to 50%, tended to have kind of like a higher success rate, but that has like slowly gone down. And again, there are many ways to kind of understand why that happened, what kinds of courses are associated to that. 2021 data, I would suggest like a good meeting with Emma Blackthorne, our research coach, because there's so much going on with the data in 2021. It's very hard to keep track of, including things being coded hybrid that were never offered as hybrid. So my suggestion right now is to just kind of look at that 2021 number loosely, but you can kind of see the range from the other periods of time. Same thing with hybrid 2. This is that 50 to 99%, which is more of like a 50-50 course hybrid. You can see has steadily grown in success rates over that period of time. Online has also grown minus our 2021, but you can see the kind of slow increase of success. And then of course our regular is kind of the benchmark by which we kind of measure these others, even though we know we need to improve our regular as well. Our on-campus face-to-face are, you know, slowly increasing, some fluctuation, but you can see how these other modalities are slowly kind of moving towards that direction. The benefits of hybrid. Students get the in-person experience, they get to ask direct questions, interact with physical presence. They like being with their peers, especially our like new first generation out of high school. You know, they want that student life part of the whole college experience. There's a benefit to corridor talks. I was speaking with a colleague last night, Lisa Ong, and she talked about missing the corridor talk. So I'm citing her here as influencing that. I liked that idea. I think it's something we do miss, and it's part of that on-campus experience, that kind of walk and talk after class. There's benefit from exposure to the campus community, things we didn't know happening in other departments. You know, you're passing through the hallway and you see a sign for a club. Some of those kind of physical experiences are things that a student can benefit from by still being physically connected to the campus. The other benefit, though, is also participating in the online. They have time to communicate in those discussions. They acquire digital literacy skills. They can reflect on self-directed learning. They get to check in on learning progress, online interface, and build virtual connections with their peers. And also students benefit from a more flexible schedule. And I probably should have put here, in addition to student benefits, that there is a campus facility planning benefit, which is that there may be more space available and better use of that space. Considerations are that instructor skill is needed in both modalities. And, you know, Crystal and Kat can definitely speak to this, but you kind of need to know both modes. That's what we're really finding out. Like, you need to know the online so you understand how to best utilize that space. And you also need to know how to make that student-centered learning drive on the on-campus experience, and finding kind of a balance between that. But is there anything, Kat, Christella, you wanted to add to that, either the benefits or the considerations?
Just one thing is, I think there are just so many options that it can raise some anxiety about, like, am I picking the right one? And you know, one thing is, like, there are many options and there are many reasons behind all these options. And so it's not like there's a specific, you know, right option. So much of it is tied to like your content, your teaching style, your needs, your students' needs. There's so many things to take into consideration. And if you're trying to kind of wrap your head around any of that, and you know, it would help to like chat with one of us or a training lead about, like, you know, your specific reasonings for wanting one modality over another, like, we're always happy to chat.
Definitely. And that's also like department advice too. Like if your department's like, hey, we want to roll out this kind of hybrid, it's nice if there's some standardization for the students. But definitely like having those conversations, if you want advice from us, or having those conversations within your departments is really helpful for planning what's the best way, what's the best mode or kind of combination of hybrid that we're going to put together. Anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, like, in speaking to, teaching styles, like Kat had mentioned, in when you're trying to decide, is this for me? Think about, like, these are really two halves of one whole. The on campus and the online are two separate entities, and yet they're the same. So thinking about, like, what is my style to begin with, and does that really flow with what I want to do, and how am I going to make those two things work together? Because I mean, like was mentioned, you do have to have a grasp on both of those things, and then also how can I make them smoothly blend. So start thinking about those things, and that's something that definitely meet with one of those one-on-one trainers to talk through, plan, come up with ideas. Definitely worth the time.
Yeah. And I think that note of like that Crystal mentioned of like that these two worlds are going to kind of go like this is very apparent of like our post-pandemic feel, which is that we are likely to have students that will return and be totally on campus. We are likely to have students that will stay totally online. And a core group of our students are likely to be in both modalities because that is where they were before, and they will definitely be operating in that space after. And so I think the more and more we can see and maybe work towards a kind of seamlessness between those two is very important. Like the experience might be slightly different, but there shouldn't be like this disconnect or this sense that the real campus is the physical campus. I think we should kind of move away from some of that because really there's probably going to be a more seamless look to how our students are operating in these two spaces. Okay, so we want to hear from you really quickly. So we're going to give you, I'm going to pop this link in the chat because, oops, and here I am, the Zoom fingers. So in the chat, if I'm going to put in this link to a Google Doc, which you should be able to edit. And what we would love to hear from you is just take a few minutes to go ahead and put in, oh, I should have put like add your name if you can, or your department, so we can kind of get a sense, but we want to kind of hear what people are thinking and what people are doing. This helps us plan, it helps us support, it helps us give administration a sense of what we're looking for, what we want in terms of instructor training, etc. But yeah, experience and or interest. It could be I have no experience, but I'm very interested. Potential benefits you see of partially online or things you're considering, whether they're personal benefits, whether they are department benefits, a particular course, student benefits, and then any potential concerns. And really, as we're kind of leaving the floodgates open, because that's the kind of point we're at right now with hybrid, is just trying to understand and gauge people's interest and so forth and concerns. So we'll give you guys some moments. In addition to adding, you can also read and watch. And we'll give everyone like 5 minutes if you want to go check the internet or look at the TV to see if there's any updates on the trial. You're welcome to do so, obviously.
He was found guilty on all 3 counts.
Thank you, John.
That was about 10 or 15 minutes ago. It was real fast. They announced it. That was it.
Really, I feel relieved.
I'm relieved. I'm very
But
relieved.
I don't know all I know is what you're telling me. So I'm more
I
anxious.
feel very relieved, but I'm also
where you have, time to interact, but also time to reflect and actually manage what you want to say in the online. Yasser, I think the question of workload is one we will be bringing up definitely. But the workload, because you're operating in those two different modalities, is a lot. Especially as you're kind of planning 2 experiences and 2 different spaces. It was interesting too. I had read an article on the kind of, new workforce that's going to be kind of like this post-COVID new workforce, and that they are also thinking of what does partially online look like and what does it mean to not be at work every day. Yeah, definitely the labs. I know sciences are really strongly considering this. Okay, well, thank you. I think these are really important conversations, and we are excited to kind of share your thinking as it informs our trainings, but also as it can help us ask for what we need in terms of support. So anything on there, we'll just take a quick moment to hear from you guys. Anything on there that stuck out to you, or anything you personally want to share? I know I shared out a few people's, but anything that stuck out to you as resonating with you, or anything that you would like to just voice out loud, even if you wrote it down on that table.
I have something, and Anne above me gave me the idea for it in the table about enrollment issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think I taught online pre-pandemic at a different college, but I do think that fully online courses have a tendency to have higher enrollment in my past experience pre-COVID. And then it'll be interesting to see what happens this fall, which I think is problematic in the sense that depending on your status, like if you're full-time or part-time, if you're part-time, that really puts you in a precarious position to like step out and try something new, and maybe, oh, I'm going to do hybrid, or and not do fully online, and then if your class doesn't fill, it gets cut, and then that's income or and so I think that that's a really important thing that will need to be addressed. And then, also hybrid, like if someone's doing completely online and someone else is doing hybrid, I don't think it rewards. I think the concept of it is good, but there's this issue about, I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but just, that like everyone deserves money and a living, and we're trying really hard, so.
Definitely. I think the other question that many people, in addition to the ones you've outlined, that should be, definitely discussed in departments, especially as you guys are going into scheduling. And you can ask these in your department meetings, is to ask about how courses get assigned. Because I think the other thing that we see a lot of is somebody building a whole course. I build this whole hybrid thing. And the next semester, I don't get that class. Or I've built this whole online thing, and then the next semester, I don't get that class. And I think that can be difficult. And so I think working close with scheduling and your bylaws around how those get scheduled and who gets to teach them is definitely something to think about and consider. And definitely is in the wider scope even of our online. This has been coming up a lot as well. Any other, yeah, John?
Uh,
Oh,
one concern that ties back into what you were just saying is I built these whole courses for the summer and the fall last year, and they were asynchronous. And I'm load banking this spring, so I'm not teaching, and I'm not teaching this summer, but in the fall, I haven't been able to find those classes on Canvas, and I have to rebuild them all again or start from scratch because there's new stuff I want to do, and it's going to be really time consuming too.
Don't
yes,
do that, John.
yes.
We can help you find your Canvas courses so that you can copy them over.
I thought you
And
could.
I would just say, like, so I taught online pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, I was already teaching online. But and I had always taught in an asynchronous mode. That was kind of, I think that was like really attractive to a lot of our online students, wanted the asynchronous pre-COVID, but I have expanded my horizons. And so this semester I'm teaching my first online like hybrid course where we do have synchronous Zoom meetings. And so I get to like see my students for Zoom meetings once a week. And you can definitely take what you've built for the online class and layer in those hybrid elements, those, okay, here's my online class, but what would I want to cover if I had, an hour and 15 minutes a week to chat with my students on Zoom? In some ways, that's a better place to be than like, I was face to face. Now I need to like move everything online. So there, like, I think where you are, JT, is like a good space.
Okay.
It's manageable to build in those synchronous moments, especially if you have a strong foundation. And so that is like one thing we would encourage everyone is, if I don't even know if this is possible, but if somehow you manage to like skip the online teaching experience, like, online teaching experience is still a really crucial, like, necessary part of hybrid teaching. It's going to be all of those, skills we've like developed over the past year, and like Canvas, and it those skills aren't going away. They're still going to be really crucial and relevant to building out hybrid courses.
Okay.
Definitely. And just a quick note, and I know Louise had her hand up.
Help me find my old classes then.
We will definitely help you find your old class. If you ever lose your class, and we have lost that, like people, they got lost.
And I'm doing three
we're good
face-to-face
about
classes in the fall, and I'd like to have some of the online elements available to them. So
Exactly.
thank
So
you.
one of the things to just one point of clarification. So when we talk async and sync, those are fully online.
Yeah.
But when there is an on-campus experience, that is the partially online, or i.e. hybrid.
Yeah.
And Kat's emphasis on that, if you take that BEOI, if you have that online teaching experience, that is kind of fundamental foundation to any kind of web enhancement, because what you're learning to do is kind of storyboard the virtual experience you want your students to have, whether that's fully online or a mix of on campus and online. So if you have those elements, you can definitely start with, pulling in the modules or pulling in the course and deciding how to edit out, but don't feel like you have to create something completely new. Really, you're trying to almost like sew together two different, it's almost a little bit more like a quilt. So with that, Louise.
I actually think the two are super complementary, and I'm excited about teaching them side by side. And I hope there are opportunities for that, a lot of opportunities. I feel like even before we went fully online, I did, and I barely even really knew how to use Canvas. I hadn't taken the BEOI or anything like that at that point, but I used it. I used Canvas a lot, just to sync up with stuff that we had done in the course. But one of my concerns is student-facing verbiage for the course descriptions, because like I'm already getting, for summer session, I'm already getting notes from students, what does this mean? What does this mean? And how do I think, and I'm sure that at your level, the college is totally talking about this, but how are we going to make, especially like, even as we're talking about in this thing, like the 1 to 50% and the 50 to 99%, I'm not even like totally clear what that means. And how is that student facing verbiage in the catalog, in the, schedule, gonna look to them so they know what they're getting?
Right. This is definitely our concern. And one of the things we're trying to figure out is the appropriate language. Like, it was mind-blowing to me to understand to use on campus as the best word for what we mean when we say physically face-to-face, because this now could be also considered face-to-face. So, and we're not all there yet, but some of our students are, and they don't necessarily dissect those differences. And so really the most precise of that, like one of the things we're trying to do is establish language so that on campus is really that way of describing what we're coding as face-to-face in our schedule. And our hybrid or partially online classes have some component of that on-campus face-to-face. So one of the things we're trying to do is keep the verbiage straight ourselves and figuring out what is the right verbiage by looking at what other colleges are doing. The second thing is trying to figure out how to communicate that clearly to students and where to communicate that to them. So we are not this, distance education is not the scheduling department, or is not this scheduling committee, but we do get looped into those conversations in regards to the advisement on verbiage and stuff like that. The other thing is when you are deciding on how to structure your course, because there may be some leeway and there might be like, well, do you want it this day, or do you want it like this or like this? Probably the best thing to do as a department is at least initially to kind of standardize what the offerings are, so that I'm not offering one thing, Crystal is offering something else, Kat has a different equation, and then Luis, you're on a different, combination too. So I'm like 30-70%, Crystal is 50-50, Kat's 20-80, and you're like 20, you're the reverse, but 20-80, then you're just like confused, like, when am I, and all the student wants to know is, where am I supposed to be? So probably one of the easiest ways is understanding if there's leverage is just starting off with a basic, like a 50-50, like half of the class, not half of the population, but one of your course sections meets on campus, and that other portion of your course is meeting online or doing the equivalent unit experience online. And that's kind of the most traditional of what we might think of as a 50-50, 50% on campus, 50% in the cloud. That said, COVID has started opening up things, which we'll get to in a little bit, like high flex, where half the class is there, half the class is elsewhere, half of it's this way and that way. But I would really, in my mind, I would advise that we are very careful about how many options, because it can create a ton of confusion. So really working to decide as a department, what are we offering, and how can we make that make as much sense as possible to the student. Okay, so with that, let me pull back onto our screen. And thank you, I'm excited to take some time with what your reflections was. Here are some of the issues, and some of these you guys noted on the reflections that you started. Sometimes a hybrid setup looks as following. This isn't necessarily bad, it's just not necessarily where the kind of good pedagogical practices kind of moving us towards. So for example, on campus, I'm the instructor, I'm going to give you an introduction, a discussion, maybe some group work. This prioritizes interaction in the on-campus experience. Then online, you go home, you read stuff, you take a quiz, you listen to my video. There's no interaction. There's no kind of sharing. There's no space of studenting other than to absorb information. Then I go back to the on-campus, and then the on-campus reprioritizes interacting and so forth. So what happens in this scenario, and what we saw a lot of, is that the on-campus experience is really rich and imaginative, and then the online experience just kind of takes a nosedive and doesn't necessarily make the best of that space and what it can offer our students and our different kinds of students, and what they may need, and the kinds of skills they can get in that online experience. Careful hybrid planning and pedagogy sizes learn both modalities. And I don't know if there's like a better, less than. I prefer not to like go into those realms, but I tend to think of like, okay, what's really good on campus, what works really well, and what works very richly in on-campus experience, and what works really well online. And sometimes they're very similar, and sometimes there's benefits to both worlds that are very different. So obviously on campus, and feel free to put anything in the chat, and we can kind of cull these and add them to our PowerPoint as we go forward. But in the on-campus dialogue, brainstorming, group planning, any kind of group work is all, it can be okay online, but right now I think a lot of people are still into that on-campus experience of group work. Problem solving, looking at issues, things that might take or need that tactileness, spontaneous conversations, quick questions are really a thing that happens a lot in that on-campus, face-to-face. First thoughts, those are all great on-campus, student-centered kind of moments. In the online, sharing works really well because people have enough time to kind of curate what they want to share. Checking in, we know that Canvas is a really useful way for students to organize their lives, their kind of studenting lives. They can see their assignments, they can see the calendar and they can see their grades. And those things are very helpful for them to check in. You can take surveys in the online that may be better than like, hey, raise your hand on how you're feeling about this essay. Like, you might not get the same feedback as let me take an online survey and really hear how you're feeling about this essay. Anything that needs collecting or curating, online platforms are great at allowing for that and organizing that. Formal discussions, peer reviews. There's a kind of spontaneity of peer feedback that can happen in the in-person on-campus experience, But the online, there's some room if you need to reflect or need to take more time. Providing examples is great in the online because the student can kind of go back to wherever they're learning and take a moment to really understand the examples that they can view in their own time and then their own space. And then sustained reflection. So just, I mean, there's tons we could add to both of these lists, but there's definitely kind of like a best of both modalities that you can reach in the hybrid. Anything that you see glaringly that we could add more to? I'm sure there's tons more.
I think any type of performance should be best on campus, like a speech or any other type of performance.
Yeah, and it would be so interesting too to see like, oh, what does the on-campus performance look like? And then what's demanded of an online performance? And like, what are the differences of those? And what do they demand from us? I think of like my own, I'm thinking of my own work now and how it operates in these two worlds. But yeah, definitely, like we love those kind of live on campus, I'm watching you performances. And, even the commercials on the TV now are showing people doing trainings on Zoom. So it's interesting to think about those. But yeah, performance, I love that
One
word.
one thing I think is just interesting about this moment is like, I think traditionally we thought of hybrid as like kind of this flipped classroom space where like students might watch our lecture online, but then come into on campus to be able to like huddle up together and do group work and like, really like project-based learning on the, on campus in-person experience. And I think part of like the anxiety right now is that we don't know like what the world is going to look like. So it can feel like this moment of like, oh, are my students still going to need to stay 6 feet away from each other? In which case, maybe instead of the in-person experience being that like huddle up and work on a project with your group, maybe the group in a COVID world work really needs to take space online and the on campus becomes something else. So like, if it feels overwhelming, it is this overwhelming moment to like, right, to like wrap your head around the shifting definitions and shifting health guidance and like all of that stuff. So just know that like we're right there with you all as, trying to figure it all out.
Definitely. And I mean, I think that figuring out space can be very overwhelming. It's certainly not something we want to like, especially to kind of summon what Luis was saying, we don't necessarily want to have our scheduling look like we're always trying to figure it out, especially for our students. But there is an opportunity here to really kind of reimagine that interface in very fluid ways. And so I think it is kind of exciting in that way to kind of understand, okay, there was this kind of traditional, like Kat said, blended learning model, but really that's almost being upended because we've seen so many different ways of learning in the online mode that has even pushed into our on campus, like how can we make that on-campus experience more student-centered as well? So with that, we have this kind of idea we were floating around pre-COVID, and I think it's still something that we're working with. We're trying to understand, what we mean by it. But we kind of term this idea of the hybrid loop, or, you know, and this ties back to this larger emphasis on mapping your assessments. Like, what's the pattern? What's the story you're telling in your classroom of going through this material? Like, what's the action involved, and what are students doing? What are they creating? What are they showcasing? Where are they able to receive feedback, revise, reflect? And the hybrid loop kind of says, like, well, where do those happen in these different modalities? And so I want to take you through these guides. What's the best way, Crystal? Should I go on Canva and?
Yeah, I mean, you can either zoom in on there, or I put 2 on the slides. For some reason, 2 of them were really blurry, but the other 2 showed up just fine.
Oh yeah, this one's perfect. So I'll keep it on the slide for here. And Crystala went and created these beautiful infographics. These are drafts of them, but I mean, I thought they were publishable right away. But these are some great ways of just kind of visually thinking about how to kind of continue that learning stream in these different modalities. And we've also included in here some of the language that's come out of our conversations with you guys in different workshops. So I want to just pull this up a little bit and just explain a couple of these. So the first one is this emphasis on getting students to collect resources and to kind of become experts in, share information, and collaborate in that way in their learning experience. So on campus, it might be that a student in that kind of performative mode presents on a specific part of a topic. They might become experts. Then they leave the classroom, they, you know, walk through the corridor, and they're in the process outside of the LMS. So they're not back in the Canvas yet, but they're outside in the world absorbing things, and they're curating further resources on those topics. And starting to pull together different things, whether it's in the online world or in their home or in their neighborhood, they're pulling information. Then they go into that online learning management system mode. So let me post those resources that I found. Let me post the things I've collected and curated. And then we move back into the on-campus. So let's say a week has gone by, and then the instructor and students are looking at what's been collected, talking about the kind of challenges or talking about those topics, and talking about what's been produced in that online experience. So there's not this kind of like either or only one type of learning happens in this mode and then only one type of learning happens in this mode. And instead, there's kind of like this continuity of space and time and place that you're working to achieve. I'll show the second one, and that's probably all we have time for is the 2 anyway, and then we'll share out all the resources, including the PowerPoint. Here's another one on documenting connections. This is the hybrid lesson, and let me pull up, oops, this one. Oops. Okay, that's a little bit better. So on the on-campus, a student might be looking at an article or theory. As an instructor, maybe you're lecturing a little on what that article or theory is. Maybe in groups, they're brainstorming examples, thinking about confusions or places that might need clarity. Maybe they're writing questions as a group or marking those spaces as a group that might be interesting, confusing, fascinating, aggravating, whatever. Then they leave the on-campus experience. The student goes, tinkers, works. They document where X occurs in their real life. So let's say that concept had something to do with, like, you know, the cosmopolitan canopy and the way that different spaces and people intersect in cultures. Now they're going out into the real world. They're kind of understanding what how that concept might connect to the world around them. Maybe they have things like their smartphone and they're documenting those spaces, but they're out doing their thing, trying to and applying the world that we just studied in paper to the world that is existing around them. And then they go to the learning management system, that online learning experience. Let me post those images. Let me post those videos. Let me post those additional articles to articulate or examine findings. And then from there, maybe I have time then to comment on my peers' work, look at feedback, see what else other people have documented. And then we go back to that on-campus experience where we look at them as a class, we give further feedback, we continue the discussion, and we enrich what we have been able to pull and collect online. So that, again, there's not this split between this mode and that mode. There's this sense that these things are really connected and give people a place to demonstrate their learning in various ways. Any questions on this? So these are just some of the things we're coming up with. If you have examples or ideas, we would, and you want to share, you don't have to share, but if you want to, please throw them our way. We're hoping to kind of create a stronger resource. Our focus has been on, for so long, increasing course success in online, but we really want to give space and attention to hybrid because we know that this is going to be a growing space in our offerings. So if there are things that come up, ideas, things like that, please let us know. A few things to keep in mind, and then I'm going to just give a quick shout out to this thing called HiFlex. Student support. This is going to be a major thing. In addition to making sure our schedules and students are easy to read and that students know what they're signing up for, as the instructor, you'll still need to have that, almost like that online cap on. The student will need to know, it will not be intuitive necessarily, where they start, what the first day looks like, where the first day takes place, and what the expectations of learning are in both of the modalities. So those kinds of practices that we talked about before, some kind of like entry welcome letter that says, this is what the start of this class looks like, is very helpful, because it may not be articulated super clearly yet in our things like our schedules and so forth. And some students may not be familiar with this modality. They might be very clear now about on campus and they might be very clear now about online, but they may be a little more murky around the partially online and hybrid. Using a survey to determine technology needs is really, really significant. At time and time again, when we've given technology surveys, we find that students often have very clear internet access with their phone. Very struggling students will have issues with technology. So we want to connect them to getting a laptop loan, which we are really, which we believe is continuing and are fighting to continue the technology loans. And the third thing is that some may or may not have printers. So when we're back to the hybrid modality, you may want to remember that many don't have printers. They might have a computer and a phone, but many lack the quick and easy way to print. And so if part of your kind of seamlessness of hybrid includes a lot of printing out of materials, then you'll just want to make sure when you're surveying your course that what you're thinking is what they're actually able to do. So keeping that in mind. And it doesn't mean don't do it. It just means then you'll need to make sure there's provided resources, like where can they connect to printing on campus? Do you recommend a dedicated printer for the course? But really probably the best thing to do is to connect them to services on campus, or to reframe the need to print. perhaps we can, you know, book a computer lab, or there's laptop carts on campus that may be able to be used for a classroom. And those are the kinds of questions you can ask us as well. Like, is there a laptop cart that can be rolled to different rooms if needed, so that we can make sure and clarify what is still available or what is not available. So when you're planning. And then tutorials on Canvas and other technologies. Really quickly, because we're running out of time, and then I can stay for a few minutes for questions. HyFlex, this is the place where we just haven't made it yet, because we know that we want to understand hybrid better before we enter into HyFlex. Though we know that there are some programs and particular classes that might be considering HyFlex. If hybrid wasn't a big open can of what is it, HyFlex is another one, which is that it's this modality of learning that offers student choice or flexibility in selecting on-campus or online experiences, or some combination thereof. So this might be that half of your class is on the campus, the other half is zooming in online. It could be that most of your class is on campus, but you're offering an online modality that is flexible, that a student, if they cannot make it, can attend online. Sometimes HyFlex is just between two different classrooms. There's a lot of variation that we find around HyFlex, and variation is exciting, but it also really takes careful planning. So we really, if any department is considering some form of this, we would love to hear what you're doing, and we would love to kind of understand better what kind of process or thinking is going into that. And if we can help support, we would love to support. But here's a setup. This is a pretty nice setup, which is that there's an instructor camera that points towards the instructor, and then a classroom view of the student. Depending on the quality of the camera and the microphone can get to the person who is speaking. There are various versions of this that also depend on how big the classroom size is, and how much money we want to spend on the camera and technology. There is a wide variety. I've put in the PowerPoint, which we'll share with you, a number of HyFlex resources. University of San Diego has this whole kind of array, a very nice visual way of understanding how HyFlex can be set up. Their setup is pretty, from my understanding, is on the more high end, where things are integrated. There's a podium that understands how to interact with the people online as well as the people in the classroom. Columbia College is putting out hybrid and HyFlex teaching materials. There's an article that Rick Robeson shared with us called A Year of Remote Teaching that starts to think about that HyFlex. Included with that is another link he shared, which is a Northern Arizona University HyFlex faculty resources. This one is fairly accessible, and maybe a program or model that we could look at and explore. And then technology wise, some of our sister community colleges within our statewide consortium have started to implement things like the OWL, which essentially is a camera / microphone that follows your face. So if I'm the one speaking, it'll kind of go towards me. And those are some of them. The drawbacks to HyFlex are, of course, if we thought the workload of hybrid was a lot, HyFlex is now adding a whole other layer that you have to do this simultaneously. So, and the only reason I'm laughing is I'm like, wow, I'm not there yet. That's not to say you're not there yet. And we are working to go there, but we are really trying to understand what that requires in terms of support, and what that needs to build it effectively. Because we know that it's been offered. I just haven't heard that it has been offered very successfully. um, the other thing where HighFlex I think has gotten some traction is in very specific courses. It started out in the California community colleges as a career ed thing, which is to say that many, and particularly in the trades. So if you had a specific certificate you were trying to get, but could not make it to one specific class or needed to take that class in the online mode for that day, you would not be leaving your certification process, or it would add to the flexibility of that person's learning experience without them losing that day of work or losing that ability to participate if they couldn't get to the on-campus experience. So those are some of the things we're exploring with HighFlex. It's possible in this next year that we'll tinker in there, but it's definitely a modality that a lot of thinking needs to be done, and a setup and a pilot. So if you're interested in that, let us know and we'll keep you in the loop. And with that, I know I'm 4 minutes over, but if there's any questions, any thoughts, this is just our brief intro. I will mention we are trying to, not completely solidified, but we are trying to do a district-wide 2-week training on hybrid learning and teaching that would be an extension of BEOI. So if you've taken online learning or anything like BEOI, or what is it called? An equivalent BEOI experience, the hybrid will just be an extension of that. So we won't go all into the Canvas-y part, we'll stay to the assessment, mapping, and design part. So with that, any questions, thoughts? Anybody want to be the HighFlex guru? Pilot?